Sergeant Jacob Jake Mercer stood at attention, his boots planted firmly on the sleek metallic floor of the Imperial War Academy's Grand Hall. The room, vast and imposing, gleamed under artificial lighting that bathed everything in a sterile silver glow. Towering figures surrounded him, officers of the Galactic Empire, their uniforms pristine, their postures rigid with authority. Their elongated limbs and smooth, chitinous exoskeletons shimmered under the lights, their expressions unreadable behind dark, insectoid eyes. At the center of the assembly stood General Zalvorek, a towering figure clad in deep crimson, the color of command. His forearms were crossed over his chest, an expression of disdain clear in his rigid stance. He surveyed Jake with the detached scrutiny of a scientist examining a primitive specimen. A human, Zalvorek mused, the translation device clipped to his collar, turning the deep, clicking tones of his native language into something comprehensible. The High Council insists that your species has value. I remain unconvinced. Jake clenched his jaw but kept his face neutral. He'd been briefed on the Empire's perception of humanity, an oddity, a crude species with clumsy reflexes, inferior balance, and unpredictable behavior. The Empire's warriors trained from birth, their coordination refined through generations of discipline. In their eyes, humans were chaotic, lacking the precision necessary for true combat mastery. With respect, sir, Jake said evenly, his voice steady. I'm not here to convince you with words. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled officers. Some exchanged glances, their mandibles clicking softly in what Jake assumed was the alien equivalent of laughter. Zalvorek did not smile. He merely raised one hand and gestured toward the far end of the hall, where a set of enormous doors slid open with a whisper of hydraulics. Beyond them lay a sprawling training arena, filled with floating platforms, shifting gravity wells, and a labyrinth of obstacles designed to test an elite soldier's agility, endurance, and combat reflexes. You will undergo a trial, the general said. The same test our warriors must pass to be deemed fit for battle. Fail, and the High Council will reconsider its foolish interest in your kind. Jake rolled his shoulders, forcing himself to remain loose. This wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. Boot camp had been the same. City kids assuming the farm boy from Nebraska would fold under pressure. He hadn't then, and he wouldn't now. The first challenge began the moment he stepped onto the starting platform. The gravity fluctuated beneath his feet, shifting unpredictably. The alien cadets watching from the sidelines moved effortlessly, their bodies adapted to this kind of training. Jake, however, had only his instincts and years of marine conditioning to rely on. He crouched slightly, adjusting the center of gravity, and pushed forward. The first section of the course was a gauntlet of moving platforms, each one rotating at odd angles. The alien recruits crossed them with effortless grace, leaping from one to another with the fluidity of dancers. Jake took a different approach. Instead of aiming for perfect landings, he adapted mid-air, shifting his weight and using momentum to his advantage. Where an Empire soldier relied on symmetry and balance, he relied on grit and rapid adjustments. By the time he reached the halfway point, he was breathing hard but still standing. The murmur of conversation among the onlookers had quieted. He didn't need a translator to understand their confusion. The next phase introduced combat drones, sleek mechanical constructs programmed to attack weaknesses. They circled him, analyzing, predicting his movements before striking with ruthless precision. Jake had no exoskeletal armor, no built-in reflexive enhancements like the Empire's warriors. What he had was adaptability. The first drone lunged and Jake dropped low, its blade skimming just above his shoulder. He twisted, using the drone's momentum against it, and slammed his forearm into its core. It wobbled, adjusting mid-air, but before it could recover, he followed up with a strike to its sensor array. The drone spasmed and collapsed. The second and third drones attacked in unison. Jake had no time to think, only react. He dodged left, then right, barely avoiding their synchronized assault. They were fast, faster than him, but they were also predictable. They moved with programmed efficiency, calculating the most logical path to victory. But logic didn't account for human unpredictability. Instead of dodging the next strike, he stepped into it, forcing one drone to overshoot its trajectory. With a sharp pivot, he grabbed its extended limb and used it as a shield against the second attacker. Sparks flew as the two machines collided. The impact sent Jake sprawling, but he recovered first, rolling to his feet before the drones could reset. In a fluid motion, he ripped a damaged blade from one and drove it into the other's core. The second drone crashed to the ground, its circuits flickering. A moment of silence followed. Then the murmurs returned, this time edged with something different. Zalvarek stepped forward, his dark gaze unreadable. He studied the fallen drones, then looked back at Jake, who was breathing hard but still standing. Crude, the general said finally. Inelegant, but effective. Jake wiped sweat from his brow, allowing himself the smallest smirk. That's the idea, sir. Zalvarek didn't smile, but there was a shift in his stance, a slight inclination of his head. Not approval. Not yet. But something close. The trial is not over, he said. Rest. Then we continue. Jake nodded. He wasn't done proving them wrong. Not yet. The air in the training arena hung thick with tension as Jake Mercer stepped back onto the platform, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness creeping into his muscles. The murmurs of the alien officers had quieted, but their eyes followed him with an intensity he could feel pressing against his skin. General Zalvarek stood at the edge of the arena, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The moment of grudging acknowledgement in his stance earlier had been fleeting. The real test was still ahead. The next stage of the trial was unlike anything Jake had faced before. Suspended platforms shifted unpredictably in midair, their surfaces slick and unstable. Between them, gravity wells pulsed erratically, tugging in different directions, warping the very concept of balance. In the middle of it all, armed sentries patrolled the course, their sharp, insectoid limbs clicking as they moved with mechanical precision. Jake exhaled slowly. The Empire's soldiers were built for this. Anatomy designed for a perfect equilibrium, reflexes honed through generations of genetic refinement. He was a human, an anomaly among them. They expected him to fail here, to struggle with movements they executed with effortless grace. He crouched slightly, scanning the shifting landscape ahead. His mind flicked back to Marine training, urban warfare drills, adapting to unpredictable terrain, making the environment work for him rather than against him. The Empire's warriors approached this course with precision, calculating their every movement. Jake had no such luxury. He took off at a sprint. The first platform tilted sharply the moment his boots touched down. Instead of fighting for balance, he let the motion carry him forward, shifting his weight to turn the stumble into a forward roll. The next jump came faster than he expected, but he didn't hesitate. He launched himself, twisting midair, barely catching the ledge of the next platform. His fingers scraped against the smooth metal, but he locked his grip, hauled himself up, and kept moving. The sentries activated. A streak of blue light sizzled past his shoulder. Non-lethal training rounds, but the sting would be real if they landed. The Empire's soldiers would have evaded with precision, moving in controlled, calculated patterns. Jake moved with unpredictability. He ducked under one blast and leaped sideways rather than forward, throwing off the sentry's targeting calculations. The platform beneath him lurched, rotating violently, but he didn't fight it. He let the momentum carry him, using the spin to push himself into a low slide beneath an overhanging ledge. The sentries hesitated. Their programming wasn't designed for erratic movement. They compensated, adjusting their aim, but by the time their calculations caught up, Jake had already moved again. He closed the distance in a few strides and drove his boot into the first sentry's torso. It stumbled, recalibrating, but he didn't give it the chance. He grabbed its arm and used it as leverage to vault himself upward, flipping onto the next platform just as another sentry fired. The bolt struck the first sentry instead, sending it crashing to the ground. The murmurs in the audience had grown louder. By the time Jake reached the final platform, his muscles burned and sweat dripped down his spine, but he was still standing. The last obstacle loomed ahead, an open stretch of shifting gravity wells, pulling in conflicting directions. The alien recruits had passed through this section by making precise, calculated jumps, landing exactly where they needed to. Jake knew he wouldn't match their elegance, so he didn't try. He ran straight into the chaos. The moment he hit the first gravity well, he felt the tug wrenching him sideways. Instead of resisting, he turned his body into the motion, letting it hurl him toward the next well. His body twisted midair as the next pull caught him, spinning him violently. He hit the ground hard, but instead of trying to control the landing, he rolled with it, allowing the momentum to send him forward. The Empire's recruits had fought for control in this section, demanding precision from their bodies. Jake let go of control entirely, using the environment rather than fighting it. He careened through the final stretch, absorbing impacts, adjusting mid-motion, and finally skidding to a stop just as he reached the end. Silence. Then, a single slow clap echoed through the chamber. Jake turned, breathing hard, sweat dripping into his eyes. General Zalvarek stepped forward, the slow, deliberate sound of his applause filling the space. The other officers remained still, their expressions unreadable. But Jake could see something different in their eyes. Not just curiosity anymore. Something closer to respect. Zalvarek studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You are not graceful, human," he said finally, his voice edged with something resembling amusement. "But you are effective." Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "That's kind of our thing, sir." The general regarded him for another moment, then nodded. "Perhaps the Empire has underestimated your kind." His gaze darkened slightly, something calculating entering his expression. "But one test does not prove capability. There is still much to learn." Jake straightened. "Then let's get to it." Zalvarek let out a low, considering hum before turning to the gathered officers. "Prepare him for battlefield simulation," he commanded. "Let us see if adaptability is enough when faced with true war." Jake exhaled, steadying himself. The real fight was just beginning. The simulation chamber was cold, the metallic scent of ionized air sharp in Jake Mercer's nostrils. Unlike the previous trials, there were no shifting platforms, no controlled obstacles designed to test reflexes. This was something else entirely. Towering holographic walls flickered into existence, forming the jagged ruins of a battlefield, complete with smoldering debris and thick, curling smoke. The sky overhead darkened to a sickly green, flashes of simulated artillery streaking across the horizon. It was a near-perfect recreation of an actual war zone. Jake's pulse steadied. He had been here before, not in this exact place, but in places like it in the real world where mistakes cost lives. The alien recruits standing beside him, however, had not. They were elite warriors, trained in precision and discipline, but their battles had always been within the controlled parameters of the Empire's carefully orchestrated engagements. None of them had faced the chaos of a battlefield, where the rules changed by the second. General Zalvarek's voice crackled through the comms. "Your objective is simple. Defend the outpost. The enemy will not stop. Adapt or be eliminated." The first explosions tore through the air before the words had even fully settled. A shockwave sent dust and shrapnel flying, and the recruits flinched, their rigid formations breaking as they recalibrated. Jake didn't hesitate. He hit the ground and rolled behind cover, motioning for the others to follow. "Get down," he barked, but they hesitated, still assessing the situation. A second blast erupted closer this time, sending two recruits sprawling. They weren't dead. Simulation rounds non-lethal, but in a real fight, they would be. Jake swore under his breath. They were too focused on responding with precision, waiting for the right moment. That moment didn't exist in a war zone. He didn't wait for orders. He took charge. "Move. Now." The sharpness in his tone broke through their hesitation, and they followed, scrambling behind cover as another barrage rained down. Their confusion was palpable. They were used to coordinated, strategic warfare, lines drawn, movements dictated. This wasn't that. This was a storm of chaos. A squad of enemy combatants emerged from the ruins, holographic projections of the Zorthan Dominion, a species known for their ruthless guerrilla tactics. They moved fast, flanking, pressing advantages. The Empire recruits reacted as they had been trained, forming into tight defensive lines. It was a mistake. Jake saw it before it happened. The Zorthan soldiers didn't engage head-on. They split, using the environment, forcing the Empire forces into a bottleneck. They hesitated, waiting for the right moment to counter. It never came. A flanking maneuver swept through the side, and in seconds, half of them were down, blinking out of the simulation as their deaths registered. Jake moved before the others could break formation entirely. Break the line. Spread out. Use the rubble for cover. His voice cut through the rising panic. You're not fighting on a parade ground. This is an ambush. Adapt. They hesitated for a fraction of a second before his urgency overrode their instincts. The remaining recruits scattered, taking cover in the ruins. The Zorthan forces adjusted, recalculating their approach, but the shift had already begun. Jake took a breath. Now came the hard part. He moved quickly, darting from cover to cover, positioning himself on the enemy's flank. The Zorthan soldiers were still focused on the Empire's standard tactics, anticipating coordinated counterattacks. They weren't expecting one human moving independently. He struck fast. A control burst from his rifle took down the first enemy. The second turned toward him too late. Jake was already moving, rolling behind debris, forcing them to split their attention. The Empire recruits, now watching him rather than following old doctrine, started to copy his approach. They stopped moving as a singular unit and instead started making independent decisions, taking cover, shifting positions, throwing off the enemy's calculated assault. What had been a losing battle turned. The Zorthan forces faltered. Jake pressed the advantage. Push forward. Don't let them regroup. The recruits surged ahead, no longer waiting for the perfect moment, creating their own openings instead. The battle shifted. One by one, the Zorthan forces fell. The tide had turned. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battlefield flickered and dissolved into nothingness. Silence filled the chamber. The recruits stood, panting, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with something else. Understanding. General Zalvarek stepped forward, arms clasped behind his back. He surveyed the scene with his usual inscrutable expression before his gaze settled on Jake. You disregarded protocol, he said. You abandoned coordinated strategy. Jake straightened. I did what was necessary to win. A long pause. Then, to his surprise, Zalvarek nodded. It would seem, the general said slowly, that we have more to learn from your kind than we thought. Jake exhaled. The battle was over, but the war to prove humanity's worth had only just begun. The training chamber was empty now. The simulated battlefield dissolved into nothing more than a memory. But its echoes remained. The recruits who had once dismissed Jake Mercer as an anomaly now stood in quiet contemplation, their rigid stance betraying the weight of realization pressing down on them. Their doctrines had been tested, their certainties shaken, and in the heart of the chaos, it had been a lone human who had shown them the way forward. Jake rolled his shoulder, working out the lingering stiffness from the battle. The adrenaline was gone, but the sharp clarity it left in its wake remained. He could feel their eyes on him, not with the quiet derision he had once endured, but with something different. Curiosity, respect. General Zalvarek approached, his footsteps deliberate, measured. There was no outward shift in his demeanor, no grand gesture of acknowledgement, but his gaze was sharper now, assessing Jake not as an outsider, but as something else entirely. You disrupted formation, broke protocol, the general said, his voice calm, analytical. Yet, you achieved victory. Jake met his gaze without hesitation. War isn't a controlled exercise. It's unpredictable. You don't win by sticking to a rigid plan. You win by adapting. Zalvorek considered his words for a long moment. Around them, the recruits remained silent, waiting. This was a moment of reckoning, not just for Jake, but for the Empire itself. The unspoken question lingered in the air. Could they accept that their way was not the only way? You have forced us to reevaluate certain assumptions, Zalvorek admitted. It was not an easy admission for him, nor for the Empire that prided itself on perfection. Your methods lack precision, but they are undeniably effective. You have earned the right to stand among us, not as a curiosity, but as a warrior. The weight of those words settled over the chamber. The recruits stiffened, their discipline ingrained too deeply to allow for visible surprise. But Jake could sense the shift in their stance. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He was one of them. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't victory, not in the way he had first imagined it. He hadn't come here to prove humanity's worth through sheer defiance, to force their respect through stubbornness alone. He had come to show them what his kind could do, to earn his place, not demand it. Then let's stop wasting time, Jake said, his voice steady. If you want to win real wars, you need to learn how to fight them. Let me teach you. Zalvorek gave the smallest nod, a rare sign of approval. Very well, human. Let us begin. The air inside the warship's deployment bay was thick with anticipation. Rows of Empire soldiers stood in disciplined formation, their armor gleaming under the sterile overhead lights. Jake Mercer stood apart from them, rolling his shoulders as he checked his weapon. This time, it wasn't a simulation. This was real. The final proving ground wasn't a training exercise or a controlled test of skill. It was war. A forward Imperial outpost on the barren world of Korthus, 7 had gone silent. Its last transmission garbled with static and urgent warnings of an unknown enemy force. The Empire had prepared for an orderly engagement, expecting a direct confrontation. Jake knew better. If the outpost had fallen so quickly, then the enemy wasn't playing by the Empire's rules. General Zalvorek stood at the head of the deployment bay, his gaze scanning the assembled troops before settling on Jake. The respect between them was unspoken now, forged through battle and necessity. The general had accepted that Jake's methods had merit. Now, they would be tested in the field. We enter with standard formation, Zalvorek announced, his voice steady. But Mercer has tactical command once contact is made. There was no visible reaction from the soldiers, but Jake could feel the shift in the air. They weren't just tolerating him anymore. They were listening. The drop ships hummed to life, their engines vibrating beneath Jake's boots as they descended toward the planet's surface. Through the reinforced viewport, he saw the outpost looming in the distance, silent, lifeless, surrounded by jagged cliffs that cast long shadows over the terrain. It was too quiet. The moment they landed, Jake's instinct screamed at him. The Empire soldiers moved in formation, precise, predictable. He could feel the ambush coming before it even happened. Break formation. Take cover, he shouted. The order came just in time. The first energy blast streaked from the cliffs, tearing through the air where the formation had been seconds earlier. If they had followed standard procedure, they would have been cut down in the first volley. The enemy emerged from the rocks. Figures clad in segmented armor, their movements fluid, their weapons brutal. They weren't the Zorthan Dominion. They were something new, something the Empire had never fought before. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved fast, using the terrain, firing short, controlled bursts to force the attackers into cover. The Empire soldiers followed his lead, abandoning rigid formations for fluid movement, adapting on the fly. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were thinking, responding, surviving. Zalvorek fought beside them, his blade flashing as he cut through the enemy ranks with precision. He had always been a warrior, but now he fought without restraint, without the limits of doctrine holding him back. He had learned. They all had. The battle raged, but this time, the Empire didn't just endure, they won. The enemy fell back, their ambush shattered. The outpost was reclaimed. The Empire had adapted. As the dust settled, Jake met Zalvorek's gaze. No words were needed. The proof was on the battlefield, in the way the Empire's soldiers stood victorious, not because of tradition, but because they had embraced something new. Jake exhaled, shouldering his rifle. "Looks like we passed the test." Zalvorek gave a rare, slight smile. Indeed, and with that, the human had not just earned their respect. He had changed the Empire forever.